and welcome to Macros with Mythili, our 30-minute program where we usually take a hard look at major macroeconomic developments in India and overseas. But every once in a while, we break away from tradition and look at developments that are on the anvil. And that's what we're going to do in this edition. We're going to take a hard look at what's being billed as a historic occasion, the visit by the US President Barack Obama, the second in his presidency to India. And as always, we're going to do it through an economic prism. We're going to look at Indo-US economic relations. But rather than span the entire range of economic diplomacy, we're going to focus on just a few key issues in the Indo-US engagement, both at the multilateral level as well as the bilateral arena. And in order to do that, I have with me three of the best brains in their respective areas. Ambassador Shyam Saran, former Foreign Secretary, Government of India, and presently Chairman, RIS, the Delhi-based think tank, Abhijit Das, head of the WTO Centre at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, New Delhi, and Alok Sheel, senior member of the civil service, who's been closely associated with the G20 negotiations. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Let me start with you, Ambassador Shyam Saran. India engages with the US both at the multilateral level as well as the bilateral level, as I said. Which of these two levels do you think we have a more meaningful engagement with fewer frictions?
Well, I have no doubt that the bilateral side, there is far more substance to the relationship than on the multilateral side. We have a much larger, I would say, bandwidth in terms of cooperation on the bilateral side, whether it is on the economic side or the security side. On the multilateral side, unfortunately, on certain global or regional issues, the two countries do have somewhat different perspectives.
How would you describe the present state of Indo-US bilateral economic relations? Are we engaged democracies or are we estranged democracies, as you yourself once put it?
Well, I think we are hopefully coming out of the phase of estrangement into engagement, given the fact that there is no doubt an upswing of investor interest in India, thanks to the political change that has taken place and a new emphasis which we see on economic reforms. I would imagine that we are actually at the cusp of a much more meaningful relationship with the United States, both on the investment side as well as on the trade side. On some of the issues relating to the global framework, that is the WTO, or our view of what the TPP would mean for India's trade interests. As I mentioned earlier, on those multilateral issues, there are differences of perspectives. But having said that, I think on the bilateral side, I think we should take account of the fact that there is actually a fairly significant progress in bilateral trade relations. After all, you know, the trade in goods and services is now $100 billion.
Abhijit, the fact is that even though Ambassador Saran talked about bilateral being more promising, on the multilateral front also we have a number of issues with the US, particularly in the area of trade. And though the US likes to lecture India on becoming more open, the fact is that if you look at the ratio of imports to GDP, our ratio is about 37% as against the US's 17%. So is the US actually far more protectionist than it pretends to be?
That's a very interesting perspective, Mythili. If we look at the entire role of US in the Doha round of trade negotiations, development was heart of the Doha mandate, number one. And number two, one of the key premises of the Doha round was that farm subsidies in US, European Union would be cut down substantially. The way the negotiations have proceeded over the past decade or so leaves little room for doubt that A, development is totally off the table, it is certainly not on the radar screen of the developed countries, and B, far from reducing farm subsidies, what we are seeing is an increased level of support for agriculture in the United States. So clearly there is a feeling that when it comes to reduction in farm support, yes, the US is certainly protectionist.
So in the case of recent controversy we saw about trade facilitation agreement and agricultural subsidies in India, where the US was at the forefront of painting India in very poor light, is it that it was completely unwarranted? The US was far more guilty than it pretended to be?
I would hesitate to pass judgment, but it is certainly clear that when it comes to farm support, the levels in US cross $100 billion, mainly in something called the green box. The level of farm support in India is much lower. The difference is that they're able to protect their farm support because it falls in something called the permissible box, whereas farm support in India falls in a box where there are some limitations. And yes, the US has been able to better manage the perception in the global media than what maybe India would have done. But that is their ability.
Alok, would you agree that, as Abhijit said, in the area of trade, where the US really calls the shots and would like to have everything, lay down the rules itself, is that true also of India's engagement with the US in the arena of multilateral, institutions of economic governance? Has that been our experience, that the US is not willing to kind of take partner countries along, particularly in the context of the G20 negotiations? We saw tremendous progress at the first G20 meeting, but after that, virtually nothing at all, because the US lost interest now that the US economy is recovering. Or is that too harsh a judgment on the US role?
Well, I have a slightly different perspective on this. This is from the viewpoint of the institutions of global economic governance and where exactly the bilateral relationships fit into that framework. The US and, if by an extension, the G7, they have dominated the institutions of global economic governance, by which I mean, the World Bank, the IMF, the UNDP, and those financial aid-giving institutions, as well as the rule-setting institutions. That would be the WTO, the UNFC, or beyond economics and finance, let us say the NPT or the Financial Stability Board. And over time, with the rise of the big developing countries, the big emerging markets, these institutions somehow, a lot of frictions and have developed in these institutions, and the negotiations have come almost to a standstill, with major differences between the developing world, especially the emerging markets, and the G7. So that is where things stood before the global financial crisis. And the G7 and the US was making some attempts to be able to incorporate the major developing countries into the global economic governance structure. They tried it through the Heligandum process, where the BRICS were invited to the G7 summits. But the BRICS never felt very comfortable with that, because they felt that it was a patronizing way of inviting them for tea. The US took the initiative to make the G20 the premier, what they call the premier institution for global economic governance. Firstly, to fight, of course, the crisis, because without the major emerging markets, you could not have a credible response or effective response to the crisis. But the other was to be able to get the major developing countries into a format where they played almost an equal role, to get them to sign up on issues which have been held up in, let us say, the WTO and the UNFCCC. The reason why the US may be losing interest in the G20 is because they felt that this grand bargain of giving a greater role to the developing countries through the G20 has not worked. And now the focus has shifted to the bilateral side. To get the systemically important countries, they would negotiate bilaterally or through regional agreements like the TPP.
So it's not that they feel that the G20 has outlived its utility now that the US economy is doing better and we don't need you. You feel it's really because they feel there's been no progress. But I'm afraid on that note, we have to slip into a very short break. But please, if you stay with us, we'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing Indo-US economic diplomacy, both in the bilateral as well as the multilateral sphere. Alok, before the break, you were trying to say that the US has given up on the G20, not because its own purpose has been served, but because it really didn't see much progress anywhere else. But if you look at the US's role in the global economy, isn't the US increasingly becoming a hegemon and not always benign?
Well, I suppose, in the post-war period, the US has been the hegemon in the way Great Britain was, in the pre-war, from the end of the 19th century to the early 20th century.
But not necessarily a benign hegemon.
Well, okay, we could debate that, but let's look at it. I'm focusing more on the way it operates as the institutional way it operates as a hegemon. It used to be by dominating the institutions of global economic governance, but since those have become dysfunctional, its interest focus has shifted from those institutions of governance to, regional coalitions of the willing and bilateral agreements by which it can still set the rules of the game through a bilateral and a regional mechanism, rather than through these institutions which have got into a logjam.
Is it that you have deliberately made these institutions irrelevant so that their reliance on the US increases? So you want the US Fed to become the lender of last resort, not the IMF?
Coming back to the question of the IMF reforms, the sense I got, on this issue of the shareholding reform in the World Bank and the IMF and the G20 was there was an expectation of some sort of a give and take between the major emerging markets and the G7, that they would give a little more of participation in the shareholding structure, and there would be some more give and take on parts of the emerging markets on issues such as on trade, on climate finance, which did not happen.
But the US is clearly mixing up IMF with climate change, with trade, and they're completely different things.
I think there was some sort of a hidden grand bargain in that. So they feel that the developing or the emerging markets have not delivered. We had delivered an advance check. And
no, but the US enjoys enormous advantage because the dollar is a international reserve currency. Remember what John Connolly said? He said, our currency, your problem. And that's always been the US's attitude, that we will do whatever suits our purpose. I mean, they will take the hindmost.
Yeah, so earlier it was, the US always had more access to hard currency than the IMF ever did.
Because they print it.
They print it, yes. Now it has become very clear because the resources of the IMF had really shrunk. And during the last crisis, most countries went to the US Federal Reserve because they're much more flexible in responding. Whereas if you go to the IMF, you have various problems. First, it's a lumbering bureaucracy. A crisis, a BOP crisis, you have to respond in a matter of days. The IMF may not react like this.
But
and then there's a stigma effect.
But the US also looks at whether you're friendly to the US, quote unquote, or not. So there's a political price to be paid, which is not there in the IMF.
No, but in the IMF as well. IMF
has stigma, but not political interests. Whereas the US will rush to the aid of Mexico, but not to the aid of India.
Absolutely, and that what you call as manifest even within the IMF.
But to a lesser degree, you have to do it more
publicly. Yes, the Europeans
publicly.
play a greater role, and the role of the IMF in the bailout of the Eurozone is, I think, is debatable. And
Abhijit, the fact is the US is increasingly unwilling to play by the multilateral rules of the game. So they're increasingly carving out these regional free trade agreements, whether it is in the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the TTIP. Now, are these partnerships not a very unilateral kind of agreement?
Mythili, it's important to bear in mind that while the Doha round of negotiations were going on, countries like India were engaging quite enthusiastically with US, European Union, Japan, Canada, Australia on services. US realized, along with a few other countries, that perhaps the extent of market access that they were wanting might not fructify through this route. So they moved away from negotiating with the entire WTO membership on services and have instead shifted to negotiating something called the TISA, Trade in International Services Agreement. So that is one manifestation of the general tendency that we are increasingly seeing from the US side. If they are not able to achieve their negotiating goals within the WTO framework, then shift to other fora.
So they start a club of their own, as it were.
Start a club of your own. So TISA is one example, although I would stick my neck out and speculate that once TISA is finalized, if it indeed is, then there would be immense pressure to include TISA within the WTO framework, because US, European Union, all the countries would want to take advantage of the dispute settlement mechanism which exists at the WTO. So they may negotiate something as a club, but they may want to infuse it within the WTO framework to take advantage of the dispute settlement. Coming to TPP, certainly US is trying to seek very ambitious market access with the trans-Pacific countries.
And it's beyond borders. In fact, they want much more say in labor standards, in competition, government procurement.
Very correct. They want to have say in how countries establish their own regulations. There was something called regulatory coherence that could have been extremely damaging. Then there are provisions on labor, environment, state-owned enterprises, under the garb of ensuring competitive neutrality, the aim is to ensure that state-owned enterprises really effectively do not continue to exist. The target, of course, is China if China in future joins TPP. The net result is we will have one set of agreements which will be governed by very stringent rules, of which US will be the leader, and rest of the WTO membership.
Okay. So it's increasingly, in fact, going to be like what Jagdish Bhakutin, I'm quoting from what he said. He says, talking in the context of TPP, he says, if I want to join a golf club, yes, I need to play golf, but I should not have to go to church and sing hymns along with other club members. So I think TPP, TTIP are a bit like that. Would you agree, Abhijit?
Absolutely, they are a bit like that because countries really have to play along with US. Whatever be the US goals, all countries have to adhere to that.
Ambassador Saran, you've been the Prime Minister's envoy on climate change. There's a recent US-China deal. How does it affect India? And do you see climate change negotiations becoming a bone of contention, the next bone of contention between India and the US?
Frankly speaking, I see no reason why climate change should be an issue between India and the United States. India is, not a major source of emission. If you look at India's per capita emissions, it is less than 2 tons per capita, where the US figure is close to 20, and the Chinese figure now is something like 25 or 26. And if you look at the major sources of emission, the gap between India and the United States and China is a very large gap. So I don't see how India can be made out to be a source of concern for the world in terms of the threat of climate change. Now, it is true that politically, the deal that has been announced by President Obama and Xi Jinping has a certain political value because of these kind of relationship that the US and China have. This is an example that both countries would like to show that on certain important global issues, they are able to come to some kind of a agreement. So I don't think that India should feel pressured or India should feel that it has to, as the Americans say, step up to the plate because what the Chinese and the Americans have been able to agree to. Having said that, there are already very major commitments which have been made by India, particularly on the side of renewable energy. So when we come to the point where India, like other countries, will be submitting its nationally determined contributions, it will draw attention to the fact that there are very significant steps that have been taken by the country in terms of promoting renewable energy, particularly solar energy and wind energy. I think the efforts that are being made by India show that we are very conscious of the fact that climate change is a major issue, not because the US is pressurizing us or China is taking certain steps, but because really it is in our own interest.
So on that note, I'm afraid it's time for us to slip into another very short break, but please do stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing Indo-US economic diplomacy, both in the multilateral as well as the bilateral sphere. Ambassador Saran, the fact is that bilateral investment treaty with the US has been under negotiation for a number of years, but there's been very little progress, even though India has BITs with 82 countries, as against the US's 46. What are the areas of disagreement? Is it the restrictions on imposition of performance requirements, local content, etc.? And does the lack of a BIT inhibit FDI from the US?
Well, it is not making progress because, again, the perspective of the two sides are quite far apart still. Whether it is the IPR issue or whether it is the issue of, how do you arbitrate, what kind of a dispute settlement procedures that you are going to be putting in place. These are issues which are not easy to resolve, particularly because the two sides have taken somewhat different positions at the multilateral level. But I think, my experience with the United States in the past has been that if there is a strong enough political will to try and overcome some of these difficulties, usually we are able to do so. After all, we negotiated the civil nuclear deal, where perhaps the differences between the two sides were perhaps much more than what it is on the trade side. Now that there is a promise of a new dynamism in that relationship, the two sides will find a way to overcome some of those difficulties. And in that context, the forthcoming visit of President Obama to Delhi is going to be a very important opportunity.
Alok, we're talking about various issues in which we engage with the U.S. Another issue where we engage with the U.S. is the issue of FATCA, tax compliance, etc., where the U.S. is casting, an unduly heavy burden on institutions and even countries like India to ensure compliance with U.S. tax laws. And if you don't, there are sanctions to impose. Likewise, if institutions, you deal, like you have seen the fines imposed on French bank like Bank Paribas because they dealt with a country on which U.S. had imposed sanctions. Are these not increasingly signs of the U.S. wanting to call all the shots itself and wanting to use economic weapons to achieve political ends?
Yes, I suppose you could agree with you there, but in addition to political ends, they feel that they are losing their tax base in an era of globalization where U.S. Companies, they sort of escape the tax net and migrate their resources overseas, and those are not available. And those are concerns which, by the way, many other countries share,
Absolutely.
Including India.
Absolutely.
And it has become one of the major themes, one of the more recent themes within the G20 on which there seems to be a fair degree of consensus both between the developed world and the developing countries. And I think that has to do with, the interface between tax collection and globalization. How do you manage that?
But isn't there something really ironic in the fact that the U.S. really was the source of the financial crisis? In fact, if there is any single one country which owns responsibility for the financial crisis, it was the U.S. But ironically, it was the U.S. which is basically kind of, everybody was turning to the U.S. and it was the U.S. which is lecturing other countries on how to manage their financial systems. Is there not something strange about that? Doctor, heal thyself, should that not be the lesson to the U.S.?
Nothing strange about that because they have the global reserve currency. So if there's a crisis in the U.S., everybody will make it has a contagion effect all over the world, and if there is such a contagion, then money flows back into U.S. treasuries.
If you have such enormous power purely because of your currency, does that not, should not responsibility go along with that enormous power? Should you not think in terms of the impact of the global economy whenever you take any actions? Are we seeing that kind of responsibility from the U.S. Fed?
Yes, that again is an issue on which the G20 is struggling. The U.S. says that, look here, U.S. monetary policy basically responds to conditions within the U.S. And we are sensitive to, the impact on emerging markets and elsewhere. But really, realistically, U.S. monetary policy responds to domestic, the economic circumstances.
And all of us are at the receiving end.
We are at the receiving end. And have been for quite some time, actually.
Absolutely, absolutely. But in a globalized world, it affects us much more. Obviously, if I can shift now to the issue of IPRs, intellectual property rights, which is again a very sore point between India and the US, particularly in the area of patents for medicines. What really is the position? We've seen enormous pressure from big pharma, particularly US companies, saying that our patent laws are not compliant with TRIPS, but they're entirely compliant with TRIPS. So what really is the problem? And should we allow the US to talk to us like that when we are TRIPS compliant?
Mythili, what we need to bear in mind is the TRIPS agreement provides flexibilities at a number of places. The way India has used the flexibilities has perhaps aroused concerns in the US. For example, the way India determines what is a new invention, the standards are very stringent, and rightly so, because in India's perspective, invention has to go beyond a particular threshold which is defined in Section 3D of the Patents Act.
And evergreening is not allowed at all.
Evergreening is not allowed. There are provisions for containing evergreening. So that is one source of tension. The second source of tension is one singular compulsory license granted by India in favor of NATCO for Nexavar, and at the receiving end was Bayer. Now, that has aroused concerns in US. So there was a Special 301 investigation that was undertaken by the US, and then there was an out-of-cycle review of India, in which rightly so the Indian government refused to participate. India's perspective was that our laws are TRIPS compliant. If you have a problem, please take us to the WTO dispute settlement mechanism, and we will fight it out over there.
Okay.
So that is where the problem really is.
Okay. So Alok, if you were to sum up Indo-US ties, both multilateral as bilateral, in just one sentence: promise, or not, potential is way ahead of what the reality is.
Absolutely. The potential far exceeds what is the situation prevailing on ground, and the US, for geopolitical, geostrategic reasons, wants India to, succeed. Sometimes it seems they want India to succeed more than India seems to want it itself.
And Abhijit, would you say that we have a long way to go? There's a lot of mutual distrust which will not go away easily.
I would agree with you with one caveat, that the mistrust over the past few months, I think that has decreased. There has been a fair bit of confidence building, as we've seen in the case of food subsidies, where the US in a way went along with India's objectives.
Ambassador Saran, your closing comments?
There is no doubt that as far as our long-term interests are concerned, the US and India have more convergent interests than they have divergent interests. Whether it is in terms of the overall the security landscape in Asia or even the global landscape, in any kind of vision that India has for its own social and economic development, where technology is going to play an important role. Don't forget that the United States of America is still the intellectual capital of the world. It is still the source of the most innovative technologies in the world. So it can be a very good partner for India as we start upgrading our industry, as we start our own journey towards a very modern technological society.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have in this edition of Macros with Mythili. All our experts, all three of them, are unanimous that the areas of convergence far exceed the areas of divergence. There might be frictions, but these are very minuscule in the larger scheme of things. So with that, thank you so much, Alok. Thank you, Abhijit. Thank you, Ambassador Saran.
Thank you.
Thank you also for watching, but we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.